Welcome back to another edition of Real Spiritual Talk Radio. I'm your host, Lamont Gates, bringing you the world of faith, metaphysicality, and spirituality. Today, my guest had a near-death experience that he describes as verifiable. Joining me today, ladies and gentlemen, is near-death experiencer Mr. Chuck Swedrock. Chuck, welcome to Real Spiritual Talk Radio.
Thank you, Lamont.
No problem at all. Glad to have you on. Now, Chuck, I usually and typically go backwards with my guests about their religious or spiritual beliefs they may have held prior to having their near-death experience. Did you have any previous religious or spiritual backgrounds before having your near-death experience?
Well, it's interesting. I was in a childhood situation where I got moved through a lot of family changes. Certainly, my mother had severe postpartum depression after a lot of her children, and she had 8 children. I was her second child. I think she was postpartum after mine, but they didn't detect it. So that has an effect on you, obviously. As those other children were discovered to have, her having that problem after their births, we move all around as kids. And so what that did is that sort of gave me a personality of having to look at my current situation to see how to take care of myself. Who's in charge now, and what do I need to do behavior-wise to fit in? So that training really kind of prepped me to have a distance from belief in the typical sense, because people keep giving you theirs and it would be different, and so it wouldn't always be the same. But typically, to answer that question, I would say is I was raised in a Baptist world, and it was called an independent Bible church because it was so small, but it had all the Baptist architecture for their belief system. I did Bibles, drills, and was dunked and etc. So I had that in that childhood.
Yes. And I noticed you're wearing an IANDS shirt with the IANDS logo on, the International Association of Near-Death Studies. And I understand prior, yes.
For near-death studies.
For near-death studies. There you go.
Not but for.
There you go. And I understand, Chuck, that you were a part of IANDS even also before you had your near-death experience. Talk about what it's like to be in an organization that studies near-death experiences and then later on having one.
Well, yeah, I think those experiences, I really like to step through how I came to this subject matter and then came into IANDS. I'll try to make this quick. But in 1980, I had a dentist appointment, and I always joke that that's a little like having a near-death experience, but different feature of the apprehension of being in that situation. And the hygienist prepped me cotton rolls, rubber dams, metal clamps. I'm a captive audience, and the dentist comes and gives me a shot of Novocaine. And he's waiting for it to take effect, and he shares this story. He was shopping the day before, met a salesman who just returned to work after having a near-death experience and being hospitalized. And the dentist tells how the salesman relates being in this near-death experience when his heart stopped and he was revived. But in that period of time before he was revived, he went into this realm where he met 2 relatives deceased, and they introduced him to a third party there that he did not know, but who he was told was a member of the family. So he was able to bring that back and go and verify that identity he felt he met for the first time in his near-death experience. Now, in the realm I'm in, we call that veridical evidence, verifiable. He got a piece of new knowledge that he had no connection with before his near-death experience. But in that knowledge he brought back, he was able to confirm a piece that helped him accept the reality of it. So that was step one. And then in 1985, about 5 years later, August 15th, a very difficult day. I had a home in the suburbs, good job, and I was in after mowing the yard and the phone rang. My wife answered the phone, few words, and then handed the phone to me and said, "It's your dad," which was my stepfather. I carry his name, Swedrock. And I said hello, and he said 3 words: David killed himself. David being his youngest child, my mother's 8th child, and he committed suicide. And instant grief. I mean, totally shocking. And I just sort of put my life on hold there and drove back the 4 hours to Pennsylvania to the homestead and went through that week with, the funeral services and everything like that. He had come home from a party, and apparently whatever depression drove him to go to the gun cabinet and get a high-powered rifle, he went up to his bedroom, put the muzzle under his chin. And my parents were in the house. That shock obviously it's unbelievable that anybody has to go through something like that. So that was moving me along this parameter of getting thrust face first into this question of death and what is. And then I began to hear about near-death experiences. I heard a couple of locals in that area I was in having talks about their near-death experience, and I've heard these first shared stories. Phenomenal. One was called Tom Sawyer, not Huckleberry Finn's Tom Sawyer, but a road worker in Rochester, New York area who had been pinned under his truck. And he was revived, and he was studied by this psychologist from University of Connecticut, Dr. Kenneth Ring, who was on the board of the IANDS organization. And Ken's interview of Tom Sawyer, it was 2 jaw-dropping hours of this phenomenon. And Ken called Tom the most psychic individual he had encountered after studying hundreds of experiencers. Tom had foresight, had abilities that were the after effects of his near-death experience. So going forward then, I began to think about forming a group, sharing group in the Rochester area. And as I started that, I found this organization called IANDS, which was formed after Raymond Moody coined that term, near-death experience. And others began to want to study it, but nobody would publish their work.
I appreciate the journey you spoke about on how you joined IANDS. Very curious about your near-death experience. We could start from what caused it to occur.
Okay. Yes, I had been in the Marine Corps. I was drafted right out of college. 6 months after my first job, I get this notice, and I report to the induction center in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then another guy comes out with a clipboard and starts reading off names and says, "Oh, you guys go up to room 3, whatever, you're now Marines." So, shock, I'm sent to Paris Island, where Marine Corps training, boot training was, and then was immediately assigned to the Marine base at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, which then gotten quite a bit of publicity for their bad water situation, but I got married housing right out of boot camp practically because I was on the waiting list. And so I lived there for 21 months, and it ate up my digestive system. The acid reflux, the hiatal hernia just above the stomach, and the acid leaking up into the esophagus. So every once in a while, medically, I'd have to get my esophagus stretched, because it was trying to close down, control that acid. So in 2003, it was in the morning, I had some granola cereal, which if you know granola, it's got some pretty sharp edges. And I drank some bad grapefruit juice. That caused that granola to come up. And at the time, I didn't realize it right away. There was a 1.5 centimeter tear inside my esophagus. And I bled out all in morning into my stomach until about lunchtime. I was starting to feel worse and worse. And I planned to go play tennis at lunch and scrap that feeling. So about lunchtime, the pressure built up and all this blood came up. Unfortunately, this is my second marriage wife now, pinned me against the counter and called 911. The ambulance gets there and the guys with the gurney come in, yeah, we've got some guy who's got split up some blood. Then I saw the volume all over the place. They changed their demeanor drastically. And immediately, attended to me and put me on the gurney and loaded me into the ambulance. And my thought was, being very exposed to this field of near-death studies, was, oh, maybe now I'll have an NDE. Now, how many people think that being loaded into an ambulance? But as I'm there, the only pain of that whole thing was throwing up the blood. I didn't feel the cut at all. And other than having to deal with the pressure of the blood, the only pain was vomiting that amount of blood. So as I'm loaded in the ambulance, and, I've got consciousness at the body level immediately, but then all of a sudden I don't. And I'm out of the body and I have a field of consciousness. Now, being around this phenomenon, I'm sure you've probably heard a number of times that people aren't oriented in an out-of-body state as they are with hearing and seeing from a body. This is a different central pattern, but it gives you most of that information as well, or even more. In this field, which is spherical, the walls of the ambulance disappear, I'm in the universe. My consciousness could go anywhere. And I have the impression then of watching as the medic in the back with my body talks to the driver. I have the feeling that my wife is in the front seat, the passenger seat. At that moment, that's what I thought. But there was this figure. It wasn't clear, but there was someone there. I felt, or sensed it, perceived it. How real it was, I came to find out later, was a lot different than I had thought. But as I'm out of that body state, I hear the medic say to the driver, can you find a parking lot and pull over and stop? Because I don't have a pulse and I can't get an IV started. The blood vessels are collapsed in the arm. And the driver says, no problem, and puts on the brakes right there in the middle of a busy 2-lane highway on his side of the road. Sirens are flaring and everything. Some technique applied to get that IV started, and I assume pressure on the body, boom, I'm back in the body. And I really don't have any more consciousness of that until they take the body to the hospital into the emergency room, and I'm there 2 days beyond that in intensive care. And I don't really have a clear sense of the perception coming back. But eventually, after 2 days, 2 hours, 2 more days in intensive care, I'm discharged and I go home with my wife. Now, just recently, I had thought that had been her spirit in the front of that ambulance, and I asked her for confirmation. She said, no, no way. I wasn't in the ambulance. I was in our car following the ambulance. And when it stopped, I had to stop. Well, that is confirmation of what I was perceiving at that point, but not who that essence was in the front seat. Now, was that my higher self? As you've heard so many near-death experiencers talk about, guardian angel, whatever vernacular out-of-body beings use to describe essences. Often Jesus is represented as being Jesus, but is not a clear figure. But the individual projects it as Jesus because the system brings you over into the most convenient belief system to fit your background at that point. And that's my opinion anyhow. But so I was back, and then I picked up and went on from there. Now, certainly, I do think the choice we get in coming back, I don't have a remembrance of. As you understand, many near-death experiencers say, I don't want to go back there. This is too marvelous in their ultimate domain reach. And then they're shown, there are these opportunities to go back, service to others, service to self, whatever, benefits from the physical point of view of going back. And it's my belief, seeing all the stories I've seen, hundreds in groups, sharing groups of people sharing these experiences, is that I chose not to have greater knowledge coming back so I could be more accessible to people who were just coming through the experience. That's my belief. And then I've gradually gotten greater and greater awareness as the decades have gone by. About 2003, whether it's a few years ago.
Wow, that's a very interesting account there. If we can go back a little bit, I have some follow-up questions to ask. Now, you stated that you were in this ambulance, and at some point they lost a pulse, which would give us the indication that there was some clinical death there. You say, yes, go ahead.
When I got to the hospital, and the medical types in your audience will understand this, they gave me 4.5 units of plasma in the body. Those veins were collapsed. They were hard to get that going until they got the IV and got the saline solution in there to do the best they could without the plasma. But 4.5 units of plasma is essentially, over half of the body's capacity, the whole blood. And to me, that's why it was a death experience. If they hadn't medically treated that body afterwards, it was gone. And that's what many experiencers say. They're given the choice to come back, and then their choice affects the result in terms of the body either being brought forward to inhabit again with their spirit, or they're gone. It's a death.
And I have heard many near-death experiencers state that their experience was a death experience. They reject the notion that there was anything near about it. They will tell you they were absolutely gone. Now, while you are in this state, you eventually pop out of your body. You have some sort of consciousness and some sort of awareness that even though you're in this death or near death state, you still have a consciousness. In fact, you believe that someone was seated in the passenger side of the ambulance that you initially thought was your wife. My question to you is, what were you feeling in this moment while you were disconnected from your body? Were you feeling peace? Were you feeling love, or were you simply in an observational state?
Yeah, I did not have pain per se, not a physical sense of pain or any fear because, hey, I'd heard enough about near-death experiences at that point. I knew what was happening to me. Now, I would say I project here that was my higher self or, a spiritual essence. I feel that we get guides and other spiritual, and it comes to us as we need. It fits our situation. There is much more aware of the larger picture than we are stuffed inside one of these. Now, I will say the one thing that is essential to my path through this topic, this subject matter, is verifiable evidence. My wife's description of being in the ambulance that stops in the middle of a busy two-lane highway, and she had to stop, that's verifiable in my mind. That's a piece of evidence that corroborates this experience from the physical side. And, there are things like that, which I'm thinking you've heard quite a few of those.
Certainly. Typically, if they're in a hospital setting, for example, and they see exactly what instruments the doctors are using to operate on them, once they wake back up and let the doctor know from the vantage point that they were in what they were using on them, the doctors are usually amazed and flabbergasted. How did you know that? So again, that goes to the veridical and the verifiable portion of the near-death experience. I had a question more about yours. While you were in this out-of-body state, did it feel that time existed or did time stop?
Yeah, no sense of time. Yeah, no, it was just the progression, which is the passage of time from this side where we see, oh, this moment came after that moment. But I have no sense of how long that would be with a ticking clock.
And eventually you just popped right back into your body after they stopped the ambulance and began to work on you. And as you stated later on, when you got to the hospital, they poured numerous amounts of plasma into you. Did you get a medical report ever stating that you died briefly?
Well, I went to the hospital recently, and this is 20 some years ago now. And they were just converting from manual records to electronic records. And the first time I called, they said they hadn't finished that task. When I got back in touch with them, they never called me back. They no longer had access to the records. So somehow the evidence I could have got from that disappeared.
Not in the system as they loaded it in electronically, in other words.
Yeah.
Yes. So you seem to have had what many would describe an out-of-body experience, but yet a brief experience. Even though it was a brief experience, many near-death experiencers who have out-of-body experiences still come back with what we call after effects. Sometimes they may lack the fear of death. They may have higher empathy levels, precognition, premonitions. I know you spoke about an individual who had a near-death experience that Kenneth Ring stated was the most psychic individual he had ever met. Did you come back with anything different about you after having this near-death experience?
I guess they've always felt there's been something different about me, but well, I think the most significant thing was total. I was already aware, as you know, before the experience that these things existed. So it was an openness to the material reality of it for those that have the experience. So I was able to slide right in to helping them. And that's where I got about 20 years running these sharing groups, for experience to be able to share with one another. And so I think my gift was be able to reaffirm for them the reality of believing in themselves. First and foremost, I think one of the most significant step we do for them is to give them a place to share their experience. And I've seen time and again experiencers like you've seen get to the opening where they change their lives because now there's a greater reality. They drop off from their communities, their relationships change because they're different physically in terms of what they perceive around them. How can you go on being who you were when now you know, and you know the consequences of what you know?
Yes, and talking about after effects, I guess those after effects look different. In your case, you came back to educate people and bring awareness and understanding to this phenomenon through the IANDS sharing groups that you're a part of. And I think that's extremely admirable. Now, we opened up the conversation with the religious question, and you stated you were given so much information that, I guess, did it make you agnostic in some way, shape, or form by the time you hit your teenage years?
No, I always had, because of that spiritual nature of being a child in prayer, I think we have, as very young individuals, especially in a certain situation like I had, you hang on to that spiritual essence. Um, so, I mean, I would believe and did believe in Jesus, but when I read the Bible, I see, I forget which chapter it was, where he says, I share these things with you, but there's a lot I can't share with you. And I think what he couldn't share with us or with that community back then is what we now know from the spiritual realm through the advancement of human experience, even science, to say, okay, it doesn't sit inside this little physical apparatus. There's a lot more to it. And we can demonstrate that, whether it's mediumship or healing gifts, people that can do phenomenal things, bringing spiritual essence through their physical.
So, after your near death experience, would you describe yourself as a Christian with a spiritual component?
I believe in the spiritual reality. I believe in Jesus. He was a true living human. I think he has that spiritual essence that we all have. I believe that we are not separate from God. We are all one. There is only one all that is, but we drift or choose these experiences in order to gain that experience. I mean, I sense a greater reality to the sense of love that Jesus has taught through the Bible and many others, Buddha and, the other religions too. So I'm definitely spiritually oriented more than any specific interpretation. I don't denigrate them. Religions have a place. They provide a home for many people. They have services for many people. Now, I've encountered a few people that try to dictate the religious perspective. You will do this or you'll perish or something. Obviously that is just their humanness.
Yes, absolutely. And many near death experiencers come back, as you stated, with the idea that there is no separation between us and God and that all pretty much are unified or one in this higher power or source.
There is one other thing I'd like to share in terms of an acknowledgement of I am in a now back into connecting with the military setting. I'm going to be trying to work with the Veterans Administration to allow them, right now, veterans who have these experiences cannot share them with their mental health provider in the Veterans Administration. And that's my goal now. And there is a gentleman out there who has taken a huge step in that direction. He was a psychotherapist for the Chicago VA. And he did what's called EMDR. A lot of people will recognize it as a way to induce the trance. And he extended EMDR where he actually, through a new technique, produced after-death communication. So it's a grief healing therapy. And what better therapy can you have healing grief than meeting with the deceased directly? And you can find his service through induced dash and ADC for after-death communication, induced-adc.com, I think it is, com or org. His name is Dr. Alan Botkin, Botkin, and you can certainly find information about him on the web. So, especially in the case of grief, see that kind of a therapist. Now, he worked in the Veterans Administration for 8 years before he stumbled onto this technique where he'd do a session with typical EMDR, brings down the client's grief. And as it begins to come down, he practiced an extension, which was to do an EMDR session with no additional direction. Let the client go to wherever they will. And over 70% of them had immediate experiences of meeting with the deceased. So you can find that technique for grief management. And there are therapists now all over the country because eventually Alan had to leave the Veterans Administration because he got shut down. They couldn't stand that notion inside their mental health department. So, and it was really best that he could go out and train other therapists. And so now you can go to his website, induced-adc.com, and there are many, many therapists that practice this that you can get in touch with there.
Very fascinating information. It sounds like you've got your hands tied in the world while trying to help educate and bring light to the matter of spirituality via near-death experiences.
Well, I could have left inside that ambulance, or from the point of view of the body, but I think I was given a choice and I had the heart to want to be able to do this.
And I'm glad you did come back to do this for us. Well, Chuck, I want to thank you for coming on Real Spiritual Talk Radio and sharing with us that absolutely fascinating account.
Okay. Thank you for this opportunity.
Ladies and gentlemen, Chuck Swedrock.